Hi, I'm Chad with Move for Guitar. This lesson is from our series Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the chords and modes of the melodic minor scale. First off, if you like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this e-guide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. This is part 6.5 from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So now that you know how to build the melodic minor scale, I'm going to talk about the chords and the modes from the melodic minor scale. And I'm not going to go too deep in this lesson. I'm going to have a whole nother series that really dives deep into this stuff with each of the scales, but I'm going to touch on it and give you a good foundation. This will really help you out and be something you can use as a reference. But like I said, I'll really go deep in other lessons. So like I mentioned before, it's most common to use the melodic minor scale and its modes over isolated chords or over chords coming from other scales. It's not very typical to take the melodic minor scale and build chord progressions out of it. It's a very awkward scale to do that in. I'll talk about that more in an upcoming lesson. But what the melodic minor scale is really good at is using its modes over isolated chords or chords from other scales. So the first mode of the melodic minor scale is just called melodic minor. There are some other names you can give it, but the most common by far is just to call it melodic minor. And that's the scale just starting on the root and going to the root, so it's just all the notes from the melodic minor scale. Just like Ionian is the exact same thing as the major scale. So the intervals are the same as the scale, which is root 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, back to root. And the chords you would get, which I talked about in the last lesson, would be your triad would be a minor triad, root 3, 5, and your seventh chord would be a minor major 7, where you're adding that major 7th in to a minor triad. That gives you a minor major 7. So what's on your screen is in G, so all these chords are going to be listed in G. So you'd have a G minor as your triad or a G minor major 7 as your 7th chord. And you could use this scale to solo over a minor triad. You could also use it to solo over a minor major 7 chord if you see that in a song or if you write your own song with that chord. But it's also really common just to use this over a regular minor 7 chord. That's done in jazz all the time, where you're superimposing the melodic minor over a regular minor 7 chord. And even though a regular minor 7 chord has a flat 7 and the melodic minor has a major 7, you use this more as a passing tone. It wouldn't be a good landing tone, and it creates a really interesting sound over a minor 7 chord. Your second mode is called the Phrygian natural 6. If you haven't seen this before, that's a sign for natural. Or a Dorian flat 2 as another common name. And a thing about the melodic minor modes is there's lots of different names you can give them. With the major scale modes, those names are set. There's just one for each. Those are really common names. You'll hear them all the time. Melodic minor, you're going to hear a lot of different names for the modes, and that can be really confusing and annoying, but that's just how it is. And I'll give you some of the most common ones. So, like I said, the second mode can either be called Phrygian natural 6 or Dorian flat 2. And the thing about the melodic minor scale mode names is they're relating back to the major scale. So the reason this is called a Phrygian natural 6 is because a Phrygian scale, as you should remember from when we talked about the Phrygian mode, is root, flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7. So this is taking a Phrygian scale but has a natural 6 instead of a flat 6. So that's why it would be a Phrygian natural 6. So that's comparing it back to a major scale mode. Or Dorian flat 2 would be comparing it to the Dorian mode from the major scale, because Dorian mode is root 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7. This is the same thing except it has a flat 2, so that would be why it's called Dorian flat 2 as a common name. So all these mode names are going to relate back to the major scale modes, which actually makes it easier to build them, because if you know your Dorian scale, you know that if you just flat the 2, you'd have the second mode of the melodic minor scale, or you could take the Phrygian mode and make it a natural 6 instead of a flat 6, or so on. All through the modes, it'll be easy to understand how to build them if you understand the major scale modes. And this mode would build a minor triad or a minor 7 chord, and since it's shown in G, it'd be a G minor or G minor 7. But this is not a common scale to use to solo over a minor or a minor 7, and really it's not a common mode at all. especially when you're talking about jazz theory, which I base everything on more of a jazz theory understanding. So it's possible to use. You can try it out, see if you like the sound, because with anything it just depends whether you like it or you can make it work. But as far as common modes go, this is not a common mode to use, and especially it's not common to use over minor or minor 7 chords. But try it out, see what it sounds like, see if you like it. And again, we'll dive deeper into all this stuff in upcoming series. The next mode, the third mode, is the Lydian augmented or the Lydian sharp 5, which hopefully you can figure out how to build that, because the Lydian scale, you know, is root 2, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6, 7. That would mean that you're just taking the Lydian scale and sharping the 5. That would give you the Lydian augmented or Lydian sharp 5. So that gives you root 2, 3, sharp 4, sharp 5, 6, 7. So the only difference between this and the Lydian mode is that you've sharped that 5. And the chords you would get from this are an augmented triad or a major 7 sharp 5 chord. And this is the first place that we're looking at where an augmented triad actually comes from. We talked about augmented triads early in this series, and this is one of the first places that it comes from the scales we're actually covering right now. It's the first one that I'm showing you that it comes from, because augmented didn't come from the major scale or major scale modes, just like diminished 7th didn't come from the major scale or major scale modes. And this isn't that common of a mode to use either, but it can be used to superimpose over a major 7 chord, and it creates a really modern, interesting sound. But it's not very common. But again, just try it out, see if you like it. It might be something that you really like and use all the time, so it's up to you to use your ears and see if you like it. And as you can see, the 7th chord that it creates is just a major 7, but instead of a perfect fit that has that sharp 5, and that's where you get G major 7 sharp 5, and that's a really interesting sounding chord, and you'll find it in modern jazz. The next mode, the fourth mode, is the Lydian flat 7, also called Lydian dominant or Mixolydian sharp 11. Hopefully you can figure out how to build that. If you compare it to the Lydian mode, you would just take the Lydian mode and flat the 7. Or if you took the Mixolydian mode, you'd sharp the 11 or the 4, because it's the same thing. So that would give you root 2, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6, flat 7. And this is a very common mode from the melodic minor scale. It's used all the time. So the first mode and this one are two of the most common out of the melodic minor scale. And this is a really common mode to use over dominant chords when you're soloing, especially dominant chords that aren't going back to the 1 chord. But that's getting a little deep into theory. We'll talk about that more in an upcoming series. But just know this is a really common mode, really useful mode to use. And the chords that are built from it, the triad is just a regular major triad, and the 7th chord is a dominant chord. So in G, that would be a G major for the triad, or the 7th chord would be a G7. The next mode, the 5th mode, is a Mixolydian flat 6, or also known as an Aeolian natural 3. Those are common names for it. So if you took the Mixolydian scale and flatted the 6, you would get this scale, or if you took the Aeolian scale and made it a natural 3 instead of a flat 3, you would get this scale, and then you'd end up with root 2, 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7. And if you took the triad, you would get a major triad. The 7th chord is a 7th chord. So in G, that'd be a G major or a G7. But this is a very uncommon mode. Again, it's not used very often, but again, just try it out, see if you like it. And again, we'll dive deeper into this in other lessons. The next mode is the 6th mode. It's called the Locrian natural 2, Locrian natural 9, or Aeolian flat 5. Those are all common names for it. And as you can tell, it's just taking the Locrian mode and making the 2 natural, which is the same thing as the 9. So these two names are saying the same thing. Or if you took the Aeolian mode and flatted the 5, you'd end up with the same thing. So that would give you root 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7. And this is more common than some of the other modes, not one of the most common, but it can be used over a minor 7 flat 5 in place of a regular Locrian mode. So anytime you have just a minor 7 flat 5 by itself, you could use this scale in place of the Locrian mode. And it's actually a less dissonant sounding scale because of the natural 2, and the actual Locrian mode has a flat 2. So it's a little less dissonant, and it's used in jazz a lot over minor 7 flat 5s. And the triads you would get would be a diminished triad, or 7th chord would be a minor 7 flat 5. So in G, that'd be G diminished or G minor 7 flat 5. The last mode is a very common mode, especially in jazz, used all the time. It's called the altered mode, the super Locrian mode, sometimes the Locrian flat 4. There's other names for it, because a lot of these modes have lots of names. The two most common you'll hear are altered or super Locrian, especially altered when you're talking about jazz. It's called that a lot. And this is a really strange mode if you just take the intervals at face value. So the intervals you end up with are root, flat 2, flat 3, flat 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7, which is the same thing as a Locrian mode but flatting the floor, because a Locrian mode is all flats except the fourth. So if you took the Locrian mode, flatted the 4, you'd end up with the altered scale or the super Locrian flat 4. But looking at this, you would think you had a diminished triad and then a minor 7 flat 5, but then also everything else is flatted. It'd be a really weird scale. And one thing that makes this scale really weird if you take it at face value is you have a flat 3 and a flat 4, and the flat 4 is actually just a 3, because there's really not a flat 4, it would just be a 3, but if you're writing them in the order of the numbers, the intervals in order, you would write it as a flat 4. So then you have a flat 3 and a 3. That's really strange because you know that minor chords or diminished chords are built with flat 3s, but major chords are built with major 3rds, so it's really hard to hear this in that context with a flat 3 and a flat 4. So what you do, especially in jazz, you reorder these intervals, and instead of being a flat 2, you'd have a flat 9. Instead of a flat 3, you consider it a sharp 9, and then you'd keep the natural 3. The flat 5 you keep. The flat 6, you still consider a flat 6, but it's most common to consider it a sharp 5, or sometimes considered a flat 13. It's the same thing. And then keep the flat 7. And this is a really useful scale in jazz type music to use over what are called altered chords. And an altered chord is when you have a dominant 7 chord and either have a flat 5, a sharp 5, a flat 9, or a sharp 9. Those are your altered tones in a dominant chord. So if you were to take this, rearrange these intervals, you could create any altered chord out of this scale. So this is shown in G. You'd have a G7 altered type chord, which could be a G7 flat 5, a G7 sharp 5, G7 flat 9, G7 sharp 9, G7 flat 5 sharp 9, or different combinations. And that would just be taking the root, the 3, the flat 7, and that would create your dominant sound, and then using one of these other tones, one of these other intervals, and those are considered your altered intervals, and adding those in, and those will give you your altered chords. And these are really common to use in jazz, especially when you're going from a 5 to a 1. It creates more tension than just going from a regular dominant chord, 5, 7 to 1. In jazz, a lot of times you want to create more tension. These chords do it. Or even if that chord isn't listed out and it's still like a G7 going to a C major 7, that's a 5 to 1 in the key of C, you could use this scale over that G7 and it creates all these altered sounds, and that just creates more tension before you go back to the 1. And like I said, that's extremely common in jazz. If you want to play jazz, learn this scale. It's used all the time. And if that's super confusing about altered chords, we're not diving deep into that in this lesson. I just want to touch on it. I'm going to have a whole series that really dives into all that stuff. It's not something I can just explain in one lesson about this melodic minor scale, but I did want to touch on it so that you know that if you want to learn jazz, this is a really important mode to learn. So really the three most important modes to learn in the melodic minor scale would be the first mode, which is just melodic minor, the fourth mode, which is Lydian flat 7 or Lydian dominant or Mixolydian sharp 11, and the seventh mode, which is the altered scale or super Locrian. Those three are the most important if you just want to really dive into melodic minor and get a lot of use out of the modes right away, especially if you're going into a more jazz type of theory. So those are the chords and the modes that come out of the melodic minor scale. Go ahead and move on to the next lesson where I'm going to talk about the harmonic minor scale. And be sure to download the e-guide. All these diagrams are in there, and be sure to subscribe because we had at least one new lesson every day.